Hello everyone, my name is Andrew and welcome back to Frames of Space.
There is a crisis of affordability right now, and a lot of it is just a crisis of housing. As the cost of rent keeps going up year after year, we have to ask ourselves, what is the solution that can make housing more affordable? One solution is an argument known as YIMBYism, which posits that high housing costs are downstream of supply, specifically a lack of the supply of homes. According to the YIMBYs, rents are high because we don't build enough housing, and we don't build enough because zoning laws get in the way. So we fix the rules, we get rid of those cumbersome zoning laws, and eventually the supply of housing catches up to its demand and housing becomes cheaper. But here's the catch. Having legal permission to build isn't the same as financial incentive to build. There is a lot that YIMBYism can do to reduce rents, but there is one specific housing problem that it can't fully fix, and that is the topic of today's discussion. My guest today is Lars Doucet, a writer and policy advocate who thinks that we need to look beyond just zoning to the incentive structure behind land itself. He is the president of the Center for Land Economics, the author of the Substack Progress and Poverty, and one of the leading modern voices for a school of thought called Georgism. Now, Georgism is a 19th century idea that suddenly found new relevance today, which is the idea that land, the physical, finite ground we all depend on, land should not be taxed based on what's built on top of it, but based on how valuable the location itself is. That is what a land value tax does. And in today's episode, he'll explain to you why a land value tax can be incredibly helpful for reducing the cost of rent, because according to him, YIMBYism, getting rid of all those cumbersome zoning laws, that creates the permission structure to build supply. But a land value tax creates the incentive. So if you already believe in zoning reform, this is the logical next step. Because sometimes the problem isn't that people can't build, it's that they don't have to, they don't need to. And a land value tax just might be the thing to fix that. Now here's my conversation with Lars Doucet. Lars Doucet, thank you so much for taking the time to come onto this podcast.
Pleasure to be here.
All right, first question, which is, I think it's not the main purpose of this interview, but I think is one interesting thing that I would like to ask you. Could you talk a little bit about your background as a video game designer?
Yeah, so ever since I was a little kid, I'd always wanted to be a video game designer. I'm retired from video games now. I don't work in that field anymore, but I guess I worked in it for probably like 15 years. And in college, right out of college, that was kind of the Flash game era, which, depending on how old you are, might have even been like before you were born. And Flash represented kind of a minor league of game development that has now vanished, because it was this kind of middle ground where you could make a mediocre game and make a mediocre amount of money. Because there was this advertisement bubble that was like surrounding it at the time. And so I got my start just making little Flash games online. I started making educational games. And so my master's thesis was a little real-time strategy game where the economic portion is all about energy economy. So you're building like a power grid, and like all the resource costs and externalities are based on like actual research. And then I worked on a small grant making a real-time strategy game about cell biology, where like your base is the cell and your like buildings and units are organelles and enzymes and vesicles and things like that. And then from there, I just went into the conventional game industry, kind of the indie space. I worked for my own company, making some games for a while. So that's a long kind of story. But the connection to Georgism is you can tell that I've had like very eclectic interests and always like an interest in economics and also pulling things outside of the world of games into the world of games. And one thing I noticed kind of early on in my career was this weird trend of housing crises in online games, which sounds kind of crazy, but there's been this like kind of trend in online games, MMOs, of like real world phenomena. Like famously, there was a plague in World of Warcraft that was just a bug, but it was infectious. And the way it spread and the way like society reacted to it was very similar to how plague dynamics play out in real life. And so epidemiologists like studied this and like wrote papers about it. And I noticed a similar trend with housing crises in virtual worlds, where there's been many massively multiplayer online games over several decades. And I noticed that despite these being made with very different designs at very different time periods by very different designers, a lot of them would reproduce kind of boom bust housing cycles and housing and land speculation in completely made up worlds with completely made up economies, which just like blew my mind. And so that's kind of the connection between Georgism and game design.
I think that provides a pretty neat way to segue, because obviously you had spent a lot of time as a video game designer, and you also talked a little bit about Georgism. Maybe just a little bit of clarification. Tell me, what is your current day job?
So I currently work for the Center for Land Economics. We're a nonprofit organization founded about a year ago. And I work with Greg Miller, who's formerly of Housing and Urban Development under the last presidential administration. And what we do is that we study land economics. We do a lot of writing on our blog, Progress and Poverty Substack. And then we also do a lot of policy analysis. So I basically study property taxes for a living. And so sometimes I kind of jokingly, like I used to like tell kids like I made video games for a living. They'd get really excited. And now like I tell people I left the boring world of video games for the exciting world of property tax analysis. So that's kind of where I'm at now.
All right. So what is a property tax? Are you advocating for a property tax?
Well, I study property tax because that's what we've got now. And a property tax is basically a tax on the assessed value of real property, which means land and buildings. So your house, your business, your apartment complex, or whatever. It's the main way that local governments fund themselves in America. But what I actually advocate for is a special kind of property tax called a land value tax, which is way better than a property tax. And that is a tax that doesn't tax the building portion at all. It only taxes the land.
All right. So like, tell me, dig a little deeper about like the differences between a land value tax and a property tax. I know you already explained it, but I want you to do the really annoying podcaster thing of re-explaining it because of how important the distinction is. And B, why is a land value tax so important to you?
Yeah, so the real functional difference between it is that you can think of a land value tax as a property tax with a universal building exemption. You know, a universal exemption on the value of all buildings and a complete exemption of the total value of all buildings.
So like, let's say that I had like this like 100-acre plot of land. Like basically you're saying that the value of the land would still be the same even if I made it into an empty parking lot, or if I made it into like a 10,000 like skyscraper that made things look as high as like Coruscant from the Star Wars movies. Like
right. Basically under a land value tax, basically if you imagine that there's an empty lot right next to the Empire State Building, right? The same footprint. Under a land value tax, those two plots should pay the same amount of tax, which is the amount of tax that the empty parking lot is paying. And some people like feel like that's kind of weird. Like isn't the building like taking up more resources and stuff? Like shouldn't the building like pay more? It's worth more. But if you think about it, what is the purpose of taxes? I mean, besides raising revenue, taxes have an effect on society. And the general effect of taxes is if you tax something, you get less of it. So we do this intentionally with things we don't like cigarettes, for instance. There is a sin tax on cigarettes. Some counties have this with alcohol. Some people do this with sugary drinks or whatever. There's talks about doing a carbon tax that never really seems to get off the ground. But the principle is the same. If there's something you don't like, you want to tax it. And you will get less of it on the margin. And the only exception to this is something whose supply is entirely fixed. And land falls into this category. If you tax buildings, you will get less building on the margin. But if you tax land, and by land we really mean location, like XY coordinates on the earth, you can't make any more of those. We've only got the ones we have. And if you tax the holding of land, you do not get less land. But what you do get is less land speculation. Because if we go back to this...
Wait, sorry. What is land speculation?
Okay, land speculation. So why is there an empty parking lot right next to the Empire State Building? I'm not sure if there actually is in that case, but there are many cases. Like, just go on Google Earth or Google Maps and go downtown to any big American city and just look. Like, go down to the central business district and look at all the parking lots. And now, if you have an open data portal, go and look up the assessed value of all that property. Or just go on Zillow and look for like recent comps or whatever. And you will find that there will be millions, sometimes 10 millions of dollars worth of value tied up in an individual parking lot downtown. And
like not even like 10 stories worth, like not even a 10-story building for parking lots. Literally just like one empty
surface
piece
parking.
Of space. Yeah.
Surface parking, overgrown with weeds sometimes, like very minimally maintained, if at all. And it can be worth millions of dollars. In my own town, I think on the main drag, there was like an abandoned grocery store that, sat empty for a decade. And the owner flipped it for 10x its price while doing nothing to it, right? And so the thing is, land speculation is basically when someone realizes it's a bet that the city is going to continue to grow. As long as the city is not abandoned, and as long as the city continues to grow, which is not always a sure bet, look at Detroit, but it's usually a safe bet, over like a 10-year horizon, then the land in that city is only going to go up in value. Like they say, buy land, it's the only thing they're not making more of and they're not making any more of. And real estate agents say, like, 3 most important rules of real estate are location, location, location. So if you can buy a location that's very valuable, and then basically just hold it out of use, you can turn it into this investment asset. And crucially, it goes up in value because of the activity of the community surrounding it, right? Like, why is it not valuable to just buy pieces of the Nevada desert and wait for it to go up in value? Because no one's building a city around your empty plot of land. People want to buy your plot of land because they want to do things with it. And so but here's the catch. Under a conventional property tax, if you build something on that lot, you will be penalized because you will pay more because the value of your building will increase the value of the total property. So you pay more in taxes. Also, if you conduct business, you'll be taxed on the conducting of that business. And so if you want to just maximize the tax advantage of your real estate asset, you will do nothing with it and you will just leave it there. And you can think, like, what's the harm? Well, the harm is this is a scarce rival good that everybody wants. That's why it's worth so much money. And as long as you are sitting there doing nothing with it, no one else can do anything with it either. And so the other thing is, in a property tax regime, property taxes are worked out backwards. It's not the case that as property values rise, your taxes rise. What actually happens is that the city sets a budget and then sets a tax rate based on solving for what do we have to multiply times the value of all the property to get the amount of money we want to raise. So what this means, the upshot of that is, if certain parcels are paying less than they should in taxes, everyone else's taxes necessarily rise proportionately. Because, like, if I were to just like exempt half the property value in a city just randomly, everybody else's property taxes would double. Because
they would need to make the revenue, right?
Because you have to hit a revenue target, right? And we can go into examples like this. California's Proposition 13 is a perfect example of this in real life. But so the point is, the fact that someone is holding land out of value hurts the city in multiple ways. Someone holding land out of use hurts the city because the most valuable land is being held out of use. No one who wants to do something valuable with it can do anything with it. Secondly, that demand spills out. This is like gentrification and sprawl, right? Because people can't build densely in the city center, because not only because of restrictive zoning, but also because people are holding land out of use, they build up where they can, which is outside of that. And so this is how demand spills out and sprawls, and raises up the land value outside. And then third, it increases everyone else's property taxes because we got to make this budget somehow. And if we're undertaxing this extremely valuable land in the middle of the city, then everyone else's taxes go up proportionately. And right now we're overtaxing buildings, we're overtaxing homes, we're overtaxing businesses. And it's effectively a subsidy for land speculators, which exist in every American city.
Yeah, so maybe one useful way to characterize the difference between a property tax and a land value tax is something that you mentioned earlier, is that like when we tax something, the supply of it goes down. Like if we tax cigarettes, then less cigarettes will be made. If we do like dumb tariffs for no reason, then the burden will go on consumers, and like those consumers will have to pay the brunt of having less supply and more expensive products and so on and so forth. Maybe the reason why like the supply of land will stay constant is because the Earth, like Mother Earth, will always have a constant surface area. Like if you were to try to like take the sphere and like unfold it, and just like calculate the surface area, that surface area will always be the exact same, no matter how much we tax individual parts of the Earth. And that like that's something that differentiates like the ground that we stand on from buildings, and is that buildings you can always build more or build less, whereas you can't like add or subtract the amount of land that exists. Would you consider that accurate?
Right. Yes. And some nuances to this. People are like, well, you can fill in the ocean, right? You can do land infill. And the key insight there is the distinction between land and improvement. By land, we really mean location. So when I say land, think location. So the location of that quote unquote water parcel was always there. It was just useless because you couldn't build on it. But if you improve it by building on it, by filling it in with dirt, now you've made it more valuable. This is just a more extreme case of just grading like in a regular or sloped site for building on. And so improvements are not necessarily just buildings. They're anything that improves the location. So in an agricultural context, crops, orchards, trees can be considered an improvement. It doesn't necessarily have to just be buildings. So when we say things like land and improvements, we're talking about locations and then things people put on top of locations.
All right. So if I have 100 acres of land, imagine two scenarios. So like I have 100 acres of land where it's all just like completely empty. There are two ways that, like, imagine that I have two solutions ahead of me about what to do. One would be to turn it into a farmland where I grow a bunch of apple trees and a bunch of cherry trees and a bunch of trees everywhere, and I make the grass a lot taller. And then the second option is that I would build a skyscraper. In which option would I end up having a higher land value tax?
Well, that is the land value tax is not going to differ in either case, assuming that both of those things that you put on top are classified as improvements, right? So what really is going to determine your land value tax is not really what you do with your land, but what your location's context is. Really, the value of the land value tax is based not on land area and not on land use, but land value, which is just the market premium that the land commands on the market. Like, how valuable is that land? And that's not really determined by your own efforts, but that of your community, the surrounding activity. So if you put your apple orchard in downtown Manhattan, there's so many people who want to do something with that space. And that is where the value of your land comes from, right? And so you may or may not be putting your land to its highest and best use, getting the most you can out of the land. But what other people are willing to bid on it is ultimately what determines its value and ultimately what determines the tax that you pay on it. And in the case of having, like, comparing it in the same location, an apple orchard versus like a skyscraper, the amount you pay in tax for land value ideally should be the same, assuming that the assessor is properly classing the orchard and the skyscraper as improvements, right? And the value that you will get from putting a skyscraper and orchard is going to determine entirely whether those are appropriate things for the site. Like, out in a rural area, an apple orchard might be the best thing you can do with that land. Building a skyscraper out in the middle of a rural area is probably a terrible idea because you're not going to get much return on that because there's no demand for a skyscraper there. But in downtown Manhattan, that's exactly where you should build a skyscraper.
All right, so then this is interesting. We talked a lot about the differences between property taxes and land value taxes, and we also talked a lot about speculation and the way that like speculation on land tends to be very terrible for that like the people in that surrounding area. So in what specific ways does a land value tax, or LVT for short, in what specific ways does an LVT pressure homeowners to make the types of land improvements that they wouldn't otherwise make, and what does that look like in practice?
Okay, so the first thing to understand is to really understand the effect. You're basically asking, like, what would the effects of a land value tax be on some place, right? A lot of American cities have the same kind of form, which is they have a semi-built up core downtown. Some places are more confined, like in a valley, like in the Northeast especially, and they might be like geographically constrained to not be able to sprawl out. But even so, like American cities tend to be pretty low rise. And so how would this affect people? Well, like some people hear land value tax and they think, okay, you're going to jack up the tax on everybody, right? And everyone's just going to pay more taxes, and like everybody gets scared. And what people don't realize is that it's proportional to the land value, and people have very bad intuitions of where land value is concentrated. So like, is this a video podcast? Will people be able to see the video?
No, people won't be able to see the video.
Okay, alrighty. But well, good thing that I'm very good at describing things. So I'm going to load up a visual here, but I will describe it to you so effortlessly with words that everyone will be able to
understand. No, they'll all be able to like even if they can't see what we're seeing, it'll be so descriptive that they can perfectly imagine it in their own heads.
Yeah. So, okay. So I am showing Andrew here a real-time 3D map of Spokane, Washington. Okay? And this is an app that we've created at the Center for Land Economics called civicmapper.org.
I'll leave a link in the show notes.
Yeah, and so this shows it's a free app, and it lets you visualize in 3D land value per square foot. So I should have done my trick and asked you before I showed this to you, how much greater on a dollar per square foot basis land in the central city is worth versus the outlying suburbs.
Yeah.
And as you can see, it's orders of magnitude. Like would it be fair to describe this as like a giant towering spire in downtown that then like quickly levels out as you go away from it?
Yes.
And then also look at this commercial corridor that just like rises like the Great Wall in Game of Thrones, and then immediately like drops off on either side, So that's an example of how zoning affects land value. Is like, and what we're seeing is basically like this kind of flat plane, and then right in the middle there's like this big wall zooming up, and that represents the land value per square foot jumping right along that commercial corridor, along that commercial area.
It almost feels like a heat map in some ways, where like everything out of that city is just like this flat thing where you can tell that it's not worth that much, and then the closer you get to the inside of the city, like the higher the price of the land just spikes.
Right. And so the thing is, when you show people this, like, so where do you think, do you think is going to pay more and who's going to pay less in like a revenue neutral shift to a land value tax? I mean, it's obviously going to be the people who live in the like minus Tirith mountain of land value downtown, right? And especially those who own property there and are doing the least with it, because they'll have the least property value exempted because of all the value in their improvement, which is going to basically be parking lots, right? Those are the people who get hosed, is parking lots that are worth millions of dollars.
Unless they're very specifically designed to be like 20-story buildings that are like parking lots with every single store as a way to house as many cars as possible.
Yeah, a parking structure. Yeah, so if we need and so some people say like, Lars, do you hate parking? We need parking. It's like, I'm not against parking. If you want parking, just do it efficiently. Just build a parking structure, a parking garage. Like I want like some stacked like volume of parking right next to where we need all the parking.
Imagine like a 45-story like parking structure where like it's like as efficient as possible, and you can house as many cars as possible.
I'm not sure we go 45 stories, but like 4 stories as opposed to 0, and then But so you see, the thing is, most people live out in the outlying areas. It varies greatly from city to city, and there are cities where you'll have like a single family home just like smack downtown. You know what I mean? But like in a lot of places, and especially in Texas, which is pretty sprawlsy, the whole Sun Belt is very sprawlsy. basically residential housing is not really competing for the most valuable land in the city. You know, like the suburbs, like the land share of the property is usually between 15 to 30%. And that means the proportion of the total property value that is just for the land. Like it's about 15 to 30% in like standard American Sprawlsville suburbs. But down in the city center, it can become like for a low value land use, like a tiny little strip mall or a parking lot like downtown. I mean, it can be 100% if it's a parking lot, or like 90 or 80% if it's this really like low rise thing where you should have a multi-story building providing either housing or business. And so how will this change things? Well, anyone who is, it will have a marked impact on our downtowns. Our downtowns will fill in very quickly. And when our downtowns fill in, that will take development pressure off of the surrounding areas. Instead of sprawling out, development will sprawl in. So in many ways, this can reverse gentrification pressure, right? Where people cannot afford, or even if they can afford, they can't have access because there's only so many parcels. They can't get that parcel they want downtown, so they get the next best thing. And then basically that jacks up the property values. Whenever your property value goes up, but your building hasn't improved at all, that's the land value going up. That's a key thing. People will be like, why did my property taxes go up? Like, my house is filled with vinyl and spiders and asbestos, and it's 40 years old. Like,
it's because of location.
Exactly. Location.
Yeah. So maybe like the whole thing about like reversing sprawl, is this like how there's some people who they work in New York City, but they live like a 2-hour train ride away from New York City because they can't actually afford the rents in New York City. You're saying that this could reverse this by forcing everyone to build like much higher skyscrapers and much higher buildings that will allow them to actually be able to afford to live in New York City?
Yes, absolutely. You know, they have what you're describing is what's called drive till you qualify. You know, where basically that's another kind of way that like housing costs are distributed is you can't afford to live in the city, but like you're anchored to that job. Like it's really job markets that people are kind of anchored to. And so it's like, well, why don't you just move to just like nowhere in Nebraska where housing's cheap? It's like, yeah, housing's cheap and there's no jobs. So what I want is a job. But then the problem is all of the landlords know that you have a high paying job. And so they're able to charge not for the services they're providing in the building, which would be fine, but for the location premium of land. And so this forces people out further and further and further and further until they get to the very limits of the commuting frontier. And so it gets a little cheaper because you have to spend all this extra money and all this extra time and all this extra pain in the butt. And this has so many other knock-on consequences. So, for instance, a lot of people talk about like the fertility crisis and like childcare and all this. Your childcare worker also needs to live in the city. Your childcare worker's salary goes to their landlord, just like yours does. And so when your childcare worker needs to commute for like 1, 2, 3, 4 hours to get to work, they need to charge more just to break even. And now you, in order to have someone watch your kid during the day so you can have a job, like you give your paycheck. Like I know people who like basically like you have two earner couples where one of them basically works to pay for daycare, which seems like what was the point of that? But then the daycare worker goes and hands their paycheck straight to their landlord too. And so there's so many other knock-on effects. Same with nurses, same with everyone. Every service worker's costs are inflated by the fact that they have to pay rent too. And even without even them benefiting from the extra costs that are happening from the driving up of all the service work, because they have to commute and they're miserable commuting in all these hours into their cities as well. And so housing costs basically seep into everything, even things that we're not directly measuring, because it's like my housing cost is this. Actually, your housing cost is higher than that because you have other things that are also inflated because of the people who have to pay their housing costs to provide you with those things.
Yeah, plus like opportunity cost, as the economists might put it.
Right. Yeah, like think of all the things I could be doing with those hours commuting, you know, all those hours, the years of my life I'm throwing away, you know, cumulatively that I could be spending with my children or doing literally anything else.
Yeah. But yeah, on the point that you made about commuting, it kind of reminds me of how, like back in the 2010s, Jonathan Haidt wrote this one book about what determines happiness levels. And one thing that he found that I thought was kind of surprising is that like increases in your income don't actually increase your happiness that much. But like reducing your commute time to work actually plays a larger role on increasing your overall level of happiness than like having a higher salary does. So that's the first that's the aside that I wanted to make. But I guess the broader point that I wanted to make has to do with the concept of in a land value tax and specifically what we're trying to achieve with it. So like what would you say the main purpose of a land value tax is? Is it to like increase government revenue? Is it to reduce speculation? Is it just like some kind of like 3D chess move to make New York City look closer to Coruscant? Like what is the purpose of a land value tax?
Well, it depends on who you ask, right? And so if the original person who popularized the idea was Henry George. And so the land value tax is different from most other taxes in that it has multiple benefits. And so you can come at it from the perspective of like moral justice, or you can come at it from the perspective of just wonky bean counter. Or you could come at it from the perspective of like what's utilitarian and efficient. And the answer is that any one of those justifications works because it kind of checks all the boxes. So from the moral justification thing, you can say that, sometimes people say taxation is theft, right? And, I think most of us agree that whether we believe that or not to some degree or not, we all live in a society and most of us don't want to abolish the police and fire the firefighters and like provide our own national defense and all these things.
Or get rid of all roads and schools and traffic lights and libraries and stuff.
Yeah. I mean, most of us are not radical anarchists. And so for those that are, we can, we can have that debate some other time. But there's the argument that land value tax is the least bad tax. That even if you don't like tax, you can at least admit that it's the least bad tax because it's the least distortionary. And the biggest losers under a land value tax would be people who are literally holding the most valuable land out of use and providing nothing to society. Like people don't live in parking lots downtown, right? There's nobody who's going to, and so this is Milton Friedman's argument, which is kind of surprising given his kind of things he supported over time. He described it as the least bad tax, right? So it has the least distortionary effects. That's one reason. The other one is kind of more moral justice. Because if you think about it, what do you rightfully have a claim to? Like there's a kind of like sense in which if I make something with my own effort, like I have the right to the fruits of my own labor. Like whatever social contract I may or may not have been pressured into, it's like if I make something, I feel like that's mine. Like that was my energy, that was my time, right? And if we agree that I had the right to whatever things I started off with and I made it with those, like why should I not be entitled to like why should you just be able to come and take something from me that like I produced? And land is interesting because nobody makes it and nobody can make it. But beyond that, also everybody needs it. So it's something that nobody made. Like if you want to say who made land, like basically it depends on your religious opinions. The only answers are God or nature, right? And the one thing we agree on is neither of those is a person, a regular human being, and not one of us at least. And so on that case, like most moral claims to land ownership basically wind up being kind of arbitrary. They're either basically like might makes right because all land basically comes down to being violently taken somewhere in the chain of transactions. Like you go through American land titles and you'll be like Smith sold to Johnson, sold to Henderson, sent to Jorgensen, sold to whatever. You go all the way back, it'll be like grant from the King of Spain, and it's the King of Spain's by right of conquest,
Yeah, or like violently taking it from the natives who lived there, yeah.
Right. There's no clean land title anywhere. Everything always has some chain of kind of violence in the system somewhere. Like all land deed titles in America will go back to some terminal title where it's basically like a land grant from Napoleon or the King of Spain or something who established it by right of conquest. And then if we want to go like, taking it from the natives, often even within the context of Native Americans, there's often like a violent history there too. And even where there's not, we certainly violently took it away from animals, right? And also it seems kind of weird that like I was here first is like some like I was here first is impossible to establish, and it's also just kind of arbitrary, because where does first begin? And the other thing is that sometimes people invoke the Lockean proviso that it's like I've mixed my labor with it and now it's mine. Well, first of all, that's kind of arbitrary. But second of all, if you're invoking the Lockean proviso, there's a second part to it that everyone leaves out, which is so long as much and as good is left for others, right? So when you've got this giant open frontier, not populated by people you're murdering and taking stuff away from, but you just imagine this giant open frontier that's actually virgin soil. It's fine to go out and stake a claim so long as it's not this perpetual deprivation of someone in a zero-sum world. But once that frontier is closed, the game, now there isn't as much and as good left for others. And this is important because everyone needs land. If you think about it, no matter how much digital stuff we've invented, like land is still fundamentally scarce. You cannot eat, sleep, work, or poop without access to a location in which you are permitted to do those actions. And if you do any one of those actions in a place where you are not permitted to, bad things can happen to you. Like, getting arrested is one of the medium outcomes. Like, you can be murdered, if you do one of those things in a place you're not permitted to do it, right? And so because land is fundamentally necessary for production, it becomes this thing that if you can own key pieces of land, it basically gives you leverage over the entire economy. And so there's various justifications for it. There's the efficiency argument, there's the moral argument, and whether or not you buy any one of those individual arguments, I think that the fact that there's a good argument from every perspective means wherever you're coming at it from and whatever your values are, I think it's pretty hard to argue with it as if we could get there, it would be the ideal tax system. Even if you hate taxes in general, it's the least bad tax. If on a moral basis, I think it's the most morally justifiable. And then for efficiency, it has a lot of efficiency purposes just for running, just for funding government and for encouraging innovation and development in the patterns that we want to see.
Yeah. So I do think it's helpful to just like understand every single potential good use case for a land value tax. And one thing that you mentioned a bit earlier is that the burden of the tax doesn't really go onto consumers in the same way that any other tax would go onto consumers. That does make me curious. So, like, obviously the supply of land never changes over time. Does that mean that, like, as a result, if we tax land, like the cost of rent will not increase; it'll just remain the same for tenants, regardless?
Right. So what happens to the tenant? Like, a lot of people say that, if you raise property taxes, you raise land taxes, that it'll just get passed on to the tenants. And the consensus is that land value tax doesn't get passed on to tenants because land value tax is kind of special. And the reason for this is whenever you look at any kind of tax, what is the mechanism by which it's passed on? Like, a lot of people were like, well, my costs increase, so I just raise my prices, and now my customers bear the cost. Well, okay, but like, customers don't have to accept your higher prices. Like, what is the mechanism that forces them to accept it? And the mechanism that forces them to accept it is the response of supply to the tax. Because if demand is the same,
maybe we could try to do, like, obviously this is an audio only podcast, but we could try to explain the concept of a supply and demand curve and what normally happens with taxes, just like
right.
Yeah.
Well, like, let me give you an example. Cigarettes, right? So we raise a tax on cigarettes. So why does so if we raise the supply on raise the tax on cigarettes, like, why do the costs increase? Well, there is this concept of like marginal cost, right? Like, if you're baking muffins in your house, maybe you can bake 10 muffins at a time, but the 11th muffin is way more expensive because your oven's not big enough, right? So in order to bake 11 muffins, you have to basically be big enough to bake 20 muffins. And so the 11th muffin is like the expensive one. And so what will often happen is there'll be like a marginal price associated with things. And profit margins tend to be pretty thin. So like at a grocery store, like the margins that they're making on like a box of cereal they're selling you is like pennies on the dollar.
And that is exactly why price controls for grocery stores never work.
Right. And tariffs, why tariffs like jack up prices so much. And so the thing is that it's like, okay, well, if there is a tax on something now, and I have to pay it, so the government basically says, you shopkeeper, like, you know, you're selling this, like, you need to like pay a tax on it, or your producer, the person who sells you the oats or whatever, like they're paying the tax. How does it get passed on? Well, cost of your components now increase to the point where like stuff that was profitable at a profit margin of 1 cent, now there's a 3-cent tax on it. Now that's a -2. You're losing 2 cents on every unit you sell. So you cut back on the units you sell because there'll be economies of scale where basically the smaller batches might have a higher profit margin. And so like you don't buy as much, you don't sell as much, and you have to, and so now there is less of whatever that good is on the market. Then people will have to pay more in order to chase the lower supply. And so the thing about what happens with land is that when land is taxed, there is not any less land. When buildings are taxed, in the long term, there will be less buildings.
Or people will build less stories, yeah.
People will build less stories, people will build less tall, people will do less renovation because they know their taxes will go up. So you will get less building and less new building. So there will be less supply of homes. With land value tax, you will get two things. First of all, there will not be any less location. The landlord has to pay the LVT whether they rent out their unit or not. And the amount that they are able to charge in rent is entirely based on what people are willing to pay. So if the landlord says, if you charge an LVT, then I'm going to raise the rents. Then you can just say to them, well, why don't you just raise the rents right now? And they're like, well, people don't want to pay that much. And it's like, well, that's, you see it, you can't just pass on your costs unless the market is configured in such a way that you have some control over supply. And so the other thing that happens, another explanation for this, is maybe you don't care about the supply and demand mumbo jumbo, but just think about this. When taxes go down, does your landlord give you a break? You know, when property taxes go down or a big exemption gets passed, does the landlord suddenly be like, everyone's rent's going down because my costs decreased? You know, and when a really good natural experiment for this is mortgage insurance rates. Mortgage insurance rates change all the time, right? Landlords have mortgages, you know, they get new properties under the mortgages, but there's almost no correlation between mortgage interest and changes in rents. You know, so if landlords were able to pass on an LVT to tenants, we would expect them to behave differently than they already do in all these other situations as well. So regardless of whether you buy the supply and demand mumbo jumbo, like the theory that landlords can pass on a land value tax would predict things that we already don't see happening with landlords' behaviors, because the cost plus pricing model for rent is just not what we observe. And the other thing is that land value tax, on top of those first order effects, encourages building. So on top of this, it will increase the supply of housing, and increasing the supply of housing is one of the things that everyone agrees decreases rents. Well, anyone who is serious, at least, you know. So not only can they not pass on the tax because we're not decreasing the supply of land, and they have to pay the tax no matter what. Additionally, the LVT is going to unlock a lot of supply because we're no longer taxing buildings. And anyone who is holding land, it's not profitable unless you're going to build something worthwhile. So you'll get a building boom that, as a second order effect, increases housing supply, and that will serve to bring rents down as well.
I'm going to use the economics mumbo jumbo again because that's my training, and that's the only way that I know how to describe it. So what the hell? Part of the reason why a land value tax Part of the reason why a land value tax incentivizes buildings to like be higher and like to have like more supply is because like when it comes to any landlord that owns the land and is like renting it out to people, the fact that they have to pay a land value tax every year means that for any given year, their fixed costs have gone up. And the fact that they have higher fixed costs means that they need to actually do everything that they can in order to have a higher profit margin to make up for the amount of taxes they're paying every year. And as a result, they're building more supply, and when they build more supply, hopefully, people know that when the supply of housing goes up, rents go down. Would you consider that accurate?
Yes. And the other thing is also like, why is land valuable in the first place? Land is only valuable because someone somewhere has a use for it that they plan on doing one day.
Location, right? Location.
Right. Location. But it's also like, it's because someone at some point wants to build apartments or housing or restaurants or something there. If no one had a plan for the land, then there would be no value to it. Like the value is not just like inherent pixie dust. Someone out there somewhere has a business plan to produce something that's going to generate value for society and for them, the investor. And so when people are holding land out of use, waiting for it to go up, they're waiting for other people to get ever more desperate, or come up, or for the city to become ever more productive, that ever more productive potential uses for that land are going to manifest. And then they're going to sit there and thwart that until they decide the time is ripe.
Are they like, they're essentially hoarding land because they're essentially freeloaders that are trying to like take advantage of all the hard work that all of their neighbors are doing as a way to appreciate their own net worth? Is that correct?
Right. And the worst part is, do you know what one of the biggest things that increases land value is? Government spending on public infrastructure and public goods. And so what's really funny is a lot of times what happens is that the government will go in and they'll build like a transit line. And all the land alongside the transit line will go up in value because being right next to a transit stop is like great because there's all this foot traffic now. And if you happen to own that land, it will go up in value, even though you did nothing to do that, right? And so it's a way for all of our tax dollars basically to go into subsidizing basically private value capture. You know, we as a society all pay for this public infrastructure, but where's our return on it? Right? Instead, we have to pay more in taxes, whether it's property taxes or sales taxes or income taxes, because the people who are capturing the windfall gains from public investment are not paying taxes on that.
All right. So as far as I can tell, there are like a few main benefits of a land value tax. It increases government revenue. It reduces all the problems of speculation that we're talking about. And it apparently also increases the supply of housing and thus it makes rent go down. Would you consider those to be the main benefits of a land value tax?
Yes. The other one is that it makes government self-funding. Because right now, government has taught itself that basically we need to like give the economy a constant haircut, and it's just a necessary evil, right? But
it's like a capital gains tax, like a tax on investment, or like a tax on the index funds that people pump out into brokerage accounts. That is like a strain on like total output for the country. Like that's bad because like the S&P 500 and like people investing is one of the main ways in which the economy grows. So if the government taxes capital gains taxes every year, it's almost like they're cutting off someone's hand every year in terms of the amount of productivity that's lost as a result.
Right. Yeah. And so what's interesting is that there's actually a kind of very dark place you can go if you actually discourage too many forms of investment. And Mike Bird talks about this in his book, The Land Trap. And this is what Japan first fell into this, and then mainland China is in the thick of it right now. And what's ironic is that in those countries, they both went through major land speculation crises, and China's in the middle of one right now, which is because the regular Chinese citizens are not really like the stock market is not very good over there. Like that's very intentionally so. They invest everything in land. And so when private citizens don't have access to capital markets, like stuff that actually builds things, they don't have access to actual productive investments, they tend to put all their money into housing and land speculation. And so not only does this mean that we're not investing in stuff that like grows the economy and like produces jobs and produces like stuff, like real things, it also just, all our investments are really just propping up a giant Ponzi scheme that's making everything more expensive for ourselves. And I think this is going to be very devastating for China in the long run, just as it like absolutely kneecapped Japan for like more than a decade. Mike, you can read Mike Bird's book about it. It goes into like great detail. But basically, like governments have kind of like feel like going back to the original idea, it's like, well, we need to give the economy a haircut because we need to get revenue from somewhere. But when government spends money, it increases the value of land. When government invests in public infrastructure, it increases the value of land. And if it were to capture the value of those increases, rather than letting private landowners capture them, then we would not need to hit everybody who's working hard and investing hard with these worse taxes, right? The government could tax the results of its own investment, and we could reduce the tax burden on income, on labor, on investment, on building, on all the things we want more of. It would basically be like everyone getting a pay raise, because they don't have to have a higher tax burden. And then if we can get housing costs under control by increasing supply and reducing the premium that goes to speculation, we can also get a pay raise by not having to pay so much in rent.
I'm fascinated by so much of this, but maybe one area of fascination that I would like to discuss is like the points you make about how a land value tax would increase the supply of housing. Because I am very familiar, and I'm sure that you're very familiar with the YIMBY movement, where they would agree that in order to reduce rents, you need to increase the supply of housing. And the way that they generally try to increase the supply of housing is by getting rid of extremely cumbersome zoning regulations that like prevent people from being able to build. To what extent do you think Georgism, or to what extent do you think a land value tax is compatible with the YIMBY movement? Do you think that like they are in tension with each other, or do you think that they're trying to find different solutions to the same problem?
I think they're both necessary. I think actually I'll go so far as saying neither is sufficient by itself. Even as a diehard Georgist, Georgism itself is not enough. You need both YIMBYism and Georgism. You need both of them because like Georgism fixes the incentives, YIMBYism fixes the permission. Like having the right incentives like does you no good if like it's illegal to build anything, right? Like, you know, I think Georgism helps create incentives and also like helps the government feel more like YIMBYism is the right solution. Because what happens when you upzone things? Land value goes up, right? And so if you are a government whose tax base is land, what is your mission in life? To increase land value, right? Increase aggregate land value because that's my tax base. And what increases aggregate land value? Making this a city people want to live in. That's it. So if you just make the city be a place people want to live, then you increase aggregate land value, or at least land value in the city center, and then you recapture that. And if that's the situation you're in, you're not going to be like, why do we have all these restrictions on downtown building? Like that's where like our greatest potential is. We want to like build more, right? And YIMBYism without Georgism without YIMBYism is it's better than not having either, but you're like having these oppressive zoning laws is like a hard constraint. Like, so we need to get rid of those. I think what's happened is that the YIMBY movement has had a lot of success, but it is now running up against some places where a lot of city councils are like, okay, well, we did all the YIMBY stuff. Like we made a bunch of reforms, but we saw some good stuff, but we haven't seen as much as we were hoping for.
Yeah, like
right?
it helped a little bit, but it didn't help as much as we wanted it to.
Right, because there's still parking lots downtown, there's still overgrown lots, there still is financial incentive to land bank and hold this stuff out of use. So you fix the permissions, but now you need to fix the incentives. And you just need both. You need good permissions and you need good incentives. And when you have both, then you unlock the potential of American cities. I work with YIMBYs all the time. I love the YIMBY movement. I see them explicitly as allies. And also, their movement has done a lot of great organizational work, and so I'm explicitly copying their political playbook and learning from it. And now, recently, with some of our own successes, we've got some YIMBYs who are starting to look at the stuff we've been doing and seeing what they can learn from us. So I think it's a very symbiotic relationship, and both of us have a lot to learn from each other.
I remember thinking like 5 years ago, like housing was getting worse, but it was also like if we were to wind the clock back to 5 years ago, or even 10, like especially 10 years ago, YIMBYism was thought of as like a politically untenable. Like we thought, oh, there's no way that people are going to be on board with this. This is like a non-starter politically. And then over the next 5 years, we gradually got to see more and more and more inroads with the YIMBY movement. And obviously, we're not off the hook just yet, but it looks like the YIMBY movement is on track to have more success over the next few years. how politically tenable do you think Georgism or the concept of a land value tax would be to voters? And do you think that your movement has been making any significant inroads in that regard?
Yes, I think so. I think one of the things for both the YIMBY movement and Georgism is that basically the material conditions have made it the answer to today's crisis, right? That wasn't the case in the 70s or the 80s or 90s, but it is the case now. And that's why people are getting increasingly interested in these ideas. The other thing is that in politics, like basically success has 1,000 fathers, right? Like everyone will say your idea is impossible, but as soon as it starts to work, and as soon as like it gets a little bit of victory somewhere, everyone will pretend like they agreed with it all along.
Cough the 2016 election cough.
Yeah. Oh, many such cases, yes. And so you definitely see that kind of follow-on effect. But it's like, I mean, politicians aren't wrong for wanting to see an idea proved out before they try it. And so that means it's incumbent on activists to doing a bunch of grunt work yourself, right? This is something I always tell people, like, don't just go and nag a politician with your theory. Like, figure out what their objections are and what the resistance is, and then go do all their homework for them. Doing a politician's homework for them is unreasonably effective. It's not a magic bullet, but it's the best way to show them that you're serious. And like basically like everything that you are asking them to do that you can in principle do yourself, just do it and like give them the answer, like do all the research, put it like make it real easy for them. And then like, oh, well, and then connect it to things they care about. Right? Connect it to things they already care about, that their constituents care about, and then get a local champion to help like connect you to those people. That's the playbook we've been following. We've been having some success with that. We've got active legislation in several states now. I think we're up to 7 that are actively considering land value tax. We are having things like state senators, Republican state senators, who are like chair of the Ways and Means Committee in their state, like start to endorse land value tax constitutional amendments. To enable it in places. Our kind of playbook is to push for voluntary adoption rather than like a big top-down victory. Like just amend constitutions so that cities can opt in if they want it, right? And then we like work with the city council to like show detailed analysis, who's going to win, who's going to lose, right? Address every objection. But we're seeing building momentum, not only in the United States, Baden-Württemberg, which is, I don't know what they call them, like a province or a state or whatever the like big regional chunk in Germany, just enacted a land value tax as of last year, and it's been in place for like a whole year now. So we're starting to see some movement internationally too. And so I think we're moving away from the days where like LVT is this like theoretical idea, and it's something that's seeing actual implementation in places now.
Oh, it's kind of like how ranked choice voting used to be thought of as theoretical idea, and now New York adopts it for its mayoral elections. It's something like that. Yeah. Right.
And then you get this, like, I mean, and then Zoran Mamdani wins, and it's this big story, you know, like I probably would have won without it. But like it becomes something like there's this thing called the mere exposure effect, that the more you are merely exposed to something, like the less weird and exotic it is. And the more like you see a face more times and you will like that person more, you know, this is exactly how this is a fundamental principle of advertising, you know? And so as we go from being, so it's going to go from some stupid nerd thing you don't care about to something that someone you respect is talking about. Your state senator's talking about it. Your friend is talking about it. You know, someone you care and trust is talking about it. And eventually it just becomes another common sense policy solution. It's just, here's another pragmatic thing we can try that solves this specific problem. And oh, that's exactly our number one problem right now. So obviously we should do this thing. Like so much of politics is just having a very narrow vocabulary. So like if you've ever heard of the politician's fallacy, it's something must be done. This is something, therefore this must be done. And so it's kind of like a joke, but it's also an opportunity. Like when something must be done, be the something, right? Because politicians, whenever there's a crisis, they like cast about for solutions. And if you're ready with a 1-pager and an FAQ and like a couple of case studies and some like pretty visualizations and a persuasive pitch, You can like swoop in and be like, here's the solution to your problem. Here's the solution to rising property taxes. Here's the solution to the housing crisis. Here's the solution to overtaxation. Here's a wealth tax that actually works, or whatever,
All right. I have a final question for you, and my final question for you is to paint two images in my head. So the first image in my head is like, imagine that all of this goes well, like the YIMBY movement continues to gain ground. We continue to get rid of the outdated like zoning regulations to increase supply. And then the second thing that happens is that the Georgism movement continues to get more ground and people become more and more familiar with it. And as a result, they become more and more supportive of the idea of a land value tax. So like, what are the main obstacles that would prevent us from getting to that like really best case scenario from 5 years from now? And B, what are some ways that people can overcome those obstacles?
Yeah, so in A, a lot of it is, I used to say that I thought the technical problem of land valuation was the hardest part, but I don't think that's the case as much anymore because I'm much more familiar with land valuation now. I do it myself. I have written an open source library that works with that. I work with assessors. I've worked with assessors in dozens of different cities. And now, like, the state of land valuation in at least enough American cities is actually pretty good that I don't think that that's this, like, huge technical barrier I thought it was. In some places it is, but all they have to do is adopt the best practices of the better jurisdictions, and they would be ready in, like, a year or two. So I don't think that's necessarily like this big fundamental obstacle anymore. And there's plenty of cities who have valuations that are good enough to just go ahead and do it right now. A bigger obstacle is going to be entrenched interests of landowners. The people who own those $10 million parking lots are not going to be happy. Now, politically, like they're pretty convenient, like group. It's like nobody lives here, dude, right? Like it's very clear to point that they're just pure rent seekers, but they have friends and those people are connected. So that's a constituency that needs to be defeated. The other thing is that I think you have to work against a lot of bad but honest intuitions. And this is, I think, the biggest obstacle actually that I'm seeing is people just have, and we just have to get much better at rhetoric and communication, because you say land value tax and people think that their land value is like the most valuable and that their taxes are going to go up. You said the word tax, they get scared. They think you're going to kick grandma out of her home. They think all these things. They think you're going to like destroy farmers. They have all these like bad intuitions that are not true, but it's on you to convince them. And also, our society is getting a lot older. The older generation owns much more the value of the land, and we're going to need to be very persuasive to them because that is the coalition that votes, and we need to figure that out. And left to their own devices, they will favor Prop 13 style carve-outs for themselves, which are perfectly rational for themselves, but it creates a real death spiral for society. I think it ties right into the housing affordability and fertility crises. But what gives me hope is a succeed anywhere strategy. Like, we don't need to succeed in my hometown. We don't need to succeed in my home state. We don't need to succeed in my home country. We need to succeed anywhere, and we need to guard that victory. And once people can see that it works, then we show that to everyone. And then as the crises continue to get worse, it will become the obvious solution. And that's kind of why my strategy is very much succeed anywhere, cast this wide net, work with people all over the world, all over the country, to get a win anywhere, defend it, and then just never stop talking about it.
Lars Doucet, thank you so much for taking the time to come onto this podcast.
Anytime, Andrew. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to hear more, make sure to follow this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere else that you get your podcasts from. Until next time, goodbye.